Good evening, everyone. On behalf of India Foundation, I, Dr. Pawan Chaurasia, welcome you all for today's panel discussion. This discussion has been organized by India Foundation in collaboration with India Habitat Center. And the topic for today's discussion is US operations in Venezuela, parachuting democracy or neo-colonialism. In order to discuss this topic of great relevance, we have a set of eminent panelists whom I would request to kindly come to the dais. May I request Shri Sunjoy Joshi, Chairman, Observer Research Foundation, Ambassador Smita Purushottam, Founder SITARA and former Ambassador of India to Venezuela, Ambassador Yashvardhan Kumar Sinha, former Ambassador to India to Venezuela and former High Commissioner of India to the United Kingdom. Kindly come to the dais. May I also request Captain Alok Bansal, Executive Vice President of India Foundation, to kindly come to the dais for the moderation. I request Captain Alok Bansal to kindly carry forward the proceedings. Thank you, sir.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening of India Foundation, India Habitat Center discussion. And today we are going to discuss a very, very interesting subject. Actually, as luck would have it, the things have changed in last 24 hours. The mood in this country at least has changed, transformed significantly. In a world which full of realists, we generally often don't look at policies, morals, ethics. And when we decided to discuss this particular subject, it was very interesting because this new year began on a very ominous note. I think in the early hours of 3rd January, you had the head of state of a particular country picked up and taken to United States. As far as brazenness is concerned, I don't think so I can find another example of that, actually. I was trying to pick my brains and think, has there been something similar which had happened? Manuel Noriega comes to mind from Panama, but didn't happen, I think so. But of course, Maduro was no angel. He had his own skeletons in his cupboards. And I think we really need to look at it. What were the options as far as this US operations in Venezuela was? Was it to bring in democracy as it exists? His vice president continues to rule the country. So we have not really seen too much of a transformation. But what is shocking is that when President Trump says that he's the acting president of Venezuela, and he's going to control the oil, and he's going to, and of course we have signed a trade deal which says India will import more energy resources from US and potentially from Venezuela. So that's very, very interesting terminologies that have been used. Potentially, gradually to zero, all these tweets we have heard in last 24 hours, all have their own significance. But again, we have 3 experts to discuss this particular subject, which is very, very important. Please understand, United States is the most important country in the world. And I think yesterday's trade deal, you can see the reaction in the markets. I think it's exponentially shot through the thing because US has been the largest destination for Indian exports, and I think even with 18% tariffs, I think Indian exporters are celebrating because that's a significant come down from 50%. So without wasting much time, I'll now request our panelists, and our first panelist is, of course, Shri Sunjoy Joshi, who needs no introduction. He is one of the leading voices as far as geopolitics in India is concerned. He's the chairman of Observer Research Foundation, has been heading it for almost close to 2 decades. He was a civil servant of the MP cadre, and has, of course, is one of the ultimate authorities as far as energy and issues related to energy are concerned. So without wasting much time, I'll request Sunjoy to speak for 10 to 15 minutes time. The time is critical. Rest you are free to express your views.
Thank you, Alok. I'll be well within the time. So you said it is my experience in energy which basically brings me to this panel. No. I'll talk of energy and geopolitics because energy is a very important part of geopolitics. And it's becoming even more and more important. But I'll frame it in the larger picture. You see, the topic is US operation in Venezuela, parachuting democracy or neo-colonialism. I have a little bit of quarrel with that framing because I think it is neither. It is neither about parachuting democracy or about advancing neo-colonialism through other means. Venezuela has to be seen in the much larger context of global happenings over some time, and yes, coming to a head during the time of Trump, but events have proceeded well beyond that. So, yes, as far as oil is concerned, the natural narrative is going that Venezuela is the country with the largest oil reserves, and therefore this has been a kind of resource grab, which the Americans have tried, and subsequent actions, meetings with Exxon and all the other Chevron to invest into Venezuela, getting a fairer regime for exploration and development, those have all made headlines. But the fact is, yes, Venezuela sits on large reserves. A large part of it is semi-proven or unproven. The figures are in a little bit of doubt as to how much oil it really has. The second part is that most of this oil is of a very bad quality. It's very heavy crude. It is difficult to extract and also difficult to refine. Only very niche refineries can process it directly. Other refineries can, but with the correct admixtures which they put into it. So it's a matter of blending with the right with the right crudes to be able to process it into ultimate end products which add value. So there are challenges there, and these are some of the reasons why Venezuelan crude has been slow to develop. And in spite of large resources, Venezuelan production fell, yes, because of sanctions, from 3 million barrels to about 1 million barrels a day. That's where it was when 3rd January took place. And even today, it's about 900,000 barrels, a small drop after all the brouhaha. That oil is still being produced, it is still being marketed, it is being sold, and it's very interesting how this is all happening. So it's an interesting story. Yes, Venezuela is important, oil is important, but Venezuela is not important for oil. Oil is a lever. And oil is a lever which is used primarily because the lever of oil, over that sits the much larger architecture of the broader financial engagement, the arrangement over which the US presides. So that control is indirect, and I would say it's a control valve. It's a small control valve, a way of turning on and turning off the spigot in certain manners. It does not solve the United States energy problems, and Venezuela's takeover does not really affect global oil supplies. Therefore, nothing happened to crude prices even after Maduro was taken. They neither rose, neither they fell. So that's the first thing. Now, as the dust settles on what happened January 3rd, let us understand, I would say that there are 3 things you must remember. See, Venezuela was, yes, it was not about drugs, certainly. It was not about oil. It was not about neo-colonialism. It was not about parachute democracy. What was it about? Venezuela was a demonstration event in the theater of geopolitics. That's what it was. And it was a signal. It was a clear message. That's my first point. My second point is, what was a signal? And this is actually things we need to think about. That in this new world, we will talk about what the new world is. In this new world, there is a new notion which is being introduced. It's a notion called, for the want of a better term, permissible sovereignty. What is permissible to a sovereign? What is not permissible to a sovereign? That's the first part. Second part is, who gets to decide what is permissible sovereignty? And how that permission is to be enforced. That is what Venezuela was about. So that was a big signal, the big message which was being sent. And it was not being sent to Maduro, it was being sent to lots of other parties, lots of other nations in the world. So it is, in a sense, signaling that there is now, yes, a new world order. This world order is a predatory world order. This order, much as you may say, Trump hates globalization and he is kind of against the globalists, not correct. Trump was very much there in Davos. And in Davos, the 2 most significant messages which came out, which are to be remembered, are primarily 2. One by President Trump, the other by Carney, Prime Minister Carney. And the basic message of both the messages is the same. They're very different in flavor, but the end message is the same. And what is that message? The message is primarily that the rules-based order does not exist. And Trump's rejoinder to that is, hey, great, let's move faster now. This is our time to move faster. These rules don't constrain us. Whether rules on environment, whether rules on trade, anything, they don't confine us. We can do what we want. Carney's message was, the rules-based order has collapsed, adapt or perish. That was his message. And how will countries adapt or perish in this new environment? So this is the primary message with the takeaways from what has happened in Venezuela. So the fact is that in a world now where rules do not constrain power, and these are not moral arguments, these are not value-related arguments. These are facts as they are. When rules do not constrain power, power defines what rules mean. The meanings of rules will change, will keep on changing from time to time. And as a demonstration event, what is the message which is going? The US justifies its actions on Venezuela very simply on the basis of saying that the narrative now coming out is not oil. They're saying because Venezuela had become a node. It had become a node where rival powers were taking foothold. Rival powers primarily meaning Russia, China, and in some way Iran. These three rival powers setting foot there. One was doing it politically, one was doing it commercially, one was doing it through security arrangements. Iran was more symbolic. So the remarkable thing is there was no imminent military threat. There was no breakdown of any international law taking place which could justify that attack. And that's why this horror when it took place in certain quarters. But the presence of rivals and America's near abroad under Trump's national security strategy, which he proudly calls a Donner Doctrine, was sufficient, that any alignment itself is sufficient cause for us to intervene thinking about security. Now, incidentally, that also makes Russia's intervention in Ukraine completely justifiable. That is an aside. Not to be discussed here, but that is precisely what it is. It also opens the door to say, okay, can China do something in Taiwan? But it allows, the message which comes out, Venezuela is chosen not because Venezuela itself was dangerous to America. It was chosen because it was useful to send this message. And it allowed US to say that alignment itself is something we will frown upon. In our neighborhood, you cannot have this. So this message actually has gone down not just to China, not just to Russia, it's gone down to various other countries. It's gone to Iran, it's gone down to BRICS. It is now being followed up by this massive buildup taking place in Iran, where the same levers, the off-caste sanctions and all that are being used to great effect. So what then is now on offer once we reach here? As I said, 900,000 barrels continue to flow. Oil trade has not stopped. Trade continues with the same major entities, please understand. The same entities are still trading that crude. Trafigura, Vitol, they're all there. Some Chinese ones may have been affected, smaller ones. But the larger ones are still there. But what changes is, what has changed is a layer of permission. Who gives the permissions? Who gives the licensing? Who allows? Which are the insurance companies which are going to operate? Which are the reinsurance companies which are going to operate? Where is it going to be sold, under what terms, under what price? Now, all that has changed. And that is where, when he says, I'm the president of, Alok mentioned, that he says, I'm the president of Venezuela, that's what is meant. The gatekeeper has changed. Who decides these rules? Who frames these rules? So please understand the sanctions and tariffs. These instruments are no longer instruments of last resort. They are tools of governance. They are tools of control. That is what they've effectively become. And enforcement in this case situation, please be very, very clear, is not going to be universal. So to say, this one is not affected, why is China not affected by these, why is India affected when the sanctions came up, 50% tariffs? These are not going to be universal. These are going to be extremely selective because compliance is a political act. And the most important transformation, therefore, we are witnessing is not the collapse of globalization. Trump is a globalist. US remains a globalist. What happens is the relicensing of globalization. Who licenses globalization? Who licenses sovereign power, the limits to sovereign power? That is what has changed. So once that is settled, what was illicit becomes semi-illicit, becomes legitimate. And in this mode of globalization, we have seen this is going to be managed through the proper administration is going to be managed through the proper administration of interdependence. Interdependence is a major factor of globalization. You take away interdependence, the fact is sanctions do not work. Choking the SWIFT system does not work. Globalization is required for these instruments to be effective. See, so that is a very clear message, and that is a very clear signal that you're seeing. So all these instruments depend on the fact of globalization. So what changes is a licensing mechanism for globalization. The power dynamics of globalization changes. Globalization does not change. So finance, very important, energy, oil, logistics, data governance, insurance, they are no longer neutral systems. They are strategic terrain. And yes, decisions are going to be taken across this terrain, and that is where the message was, okay, countries have to adapt or perish. That was Carney's message. They will need to learn to adapt, and how they're going to adapt is going to really matter. So this order, yes, produces several destabilizing consequences. What are they? First, it increases the risk of miscalculation. That is definitely there. And all these risks have to be managed. And this is something which, yes, the US is managing and will have to manage as time goes on. The risk of miscalculation is that when enforcement is discretionary, actors are going to test their boundaries. And we've repeatedly seen it, that actors are going to test their boundaries. Escalation will become incremental and eventually much harder to reverse. Second, it actually incentivizes the development of counter systems. Because if leverage is all that matters, then other countries will shift and change to develop reverse leverage, where they can use it. So alternate payment systems, alternate shipping networks, alternate legal frameworks. So fragmentation, the reverse process of fragmentation starts accelerating. Now that is the game which will have to be managed if, as I said, globalization is going to be delivered, and globalization cannot go away under this kind of administration. So globalization stays. So these are things which will have to be managed. And how you manage this is basically going to be the task which needs to be watched. So yes, it rings the death knell of multilateralism, that is true, but that is a fact which has to be accepted. The message at Davos from both was very clear, Carney and Trump. Multilateralism is practically dead. Let's stop singing pains of it, and let's stop leaning back upon it. So that is all I have to say. The biggest issue that arises now, to conclude, in a world, and we can go into discuss what it means for the third world, what it means for other countries during quick Q&A with their questions. But in a world where order is maintained not by shared rules, but by selective enforcement, the greatest risk is not military confrontation. I mean, we keep talking about a Second World War, Third World War. That is not the greatest risk. I'll tell you what the greatest risk is. The greatest risk is the quiet normalization of coercion as a mode of governance. In adapting, we adapt to accept those modes. That is the danger. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunjoy. That was, I think, brilliant as expected. Of course, I have a few questions, I think, which comes to mind. Of course, not from him. We'll discuss it, I think, once the Q&A comes. Permissible sovereignty. Where does it end? End of the rule-based international order. See, the concern tomorrow is that visiting heads of states or heads of government, visiting United Nations in New York, could also be picked up. If somebody can be picked up from Caracas, why can't you pick them up from New York and again prosecute them in the Metropolitan Court in New Jersey or New York? That's a question that comes to mind, because where do you draw the line? Now that's an issue. And I think Carey did not say adopt or perish. He actually used the Marxian axiom to say unite to confront or perish. That was, I think, the message that he gave. Well, I'll request my second speaker, Ambassador Smita Purushottam. And Smita, as you know, is a firebrand advocate of indigenization, indigenous technology. She's a founder of SITARA, a think tank which promotes indigenous technology. She has been our envoy to Venezuela, Switzerland. She has served in Beijing, Moscow, Berlin. So without wasting much time, over to you. 10 to 15 minutes.
Thank you so much, Alok. I'm really very honored to be here. and such a huge audience. I didn't expect it, and really very fascinating, your talk, Dr. Joshi. And I must say that my perspective differs a little, perhaps because it's colored by my experience of living in Venezuela. So I will just quickly go into three things. One is the characteristics of this extraction, then the reactions in Venezuela in particular, and of course around the world, and why the US did what it did. And again, I think my entire take will be colored by the fact that I served there and I saw what the Chavistas had done to that country. So do excuse the fact that I may not be taking as universalist or globalist a perspective as Dr. Joshi has done, and it's fascinating, and I've taken, there are a lot of takeaways from what you have said. For me. So first of all, the extraction, which was done in a very efficacious manner, raised questions immediately about the superiority of American technology vis-a-vis the Russian and Chinese supplied equipment. And I'm interested in technology. That's why that's one of the angles that struck me. And that's why I think the Russian ambassador also came out with a statement saying that he suspected there was internal collusion, which led to the very rapid capitulation of the regime. And the fact is that, yes, a lot of force was brought to bear, 150 aircraft were flown in, but they say that the Russian-supplied missiles were not connected to radar networks, and also later, not later, in fact, the state of the Venezuelan military, which we also witnessed, perhaps Ambassador Yash will also bear me out on this, it had been reduced to a force which was basically in charge of internal political control of dissent and not really an effective military force. So that perhaps, it was more a negotiated surrender than the dramatic narrative that we have been, fed. Now, what did the Americans do before this? They tried very hard to remove Maduro. They've been trying for quite some time. They imposed sanctions. Then they recognized Juan Guaido after the rigged 2018 elections. Following that, they even offered, the relaxation of sanctions in exchange for a promise to hold free and fair elections. But Maduro, of course, reneged on that and marginalized Maria Corina Machado, who is one of the most respected opposition politicians in Venezuela, regardless of the fact that people have been criticizing her for some genuflections that she has made. But my Venezuelan friends, whom I'm still in touch with, they said it was necessary to get President Trump on board of a free and sovereign and democratic Venezuela. So, but none of this worked. Finally, they offered him safe passage, but I think he responded with a clip that went viral of him dancing, and then that seemed to be the final provocation. I'm not being facetious. This is the sequence of events that preceded the operation. Now, regarding the reaction in Europe, of course, supported it, and this is in contrast to their position on Greenland and Denmark. I'll come to that later. There was a big divide in Latin and Central America. Some nations supported, some others didn't. And again, interesting divide. It was between leftist and rightist-leaning governments, but also there were principles at stake. One is what Dr. Joshi mentioned, the issue of sovereignty and the history of American interventions in Latin and Central America, which led to a lot of mayhem and dictatorship. On the other hand, the situation in Venezuela also merited some sympathy in terms of the humanitarian crisis that had been going on there. So India's reaction was very measured. It was basically we expressed concern over the humanitarian situation, over the welfare of the people of Venezuela, which is in line with the advice that we were sending from there to our government. In Venezuela, it was the most interesting. Without exception, the people I called, each one, rich and poor, left or right, they all have heaved a sigh of relief at the departure of this particular gentleman. Tinged, of course, with great unease because the Chavistas have been left in power. Dr. Joshi has said that has its own implications. But still, there has been. And why has this happened? Because the Chavistas really destroyed the social fabric, destroyed the economy, destroyed agriculture. And that was really bad because when the oil economy collapsed, they had no money for imports and starvation ensued. And after I left, I got horrendous news reports from there about starvation and famine, and people, 8 million people, there was an exodus of 8 million people from Venezuela. So that was the situation there, and that was why they, in fact, I was contrasting my stay in China and the Soviet Union. I lived in the Soviet Union as a kid. And, the communist regimes there, they believed in improving and increasing sovereign productive capacity. Unlike in Venezuela, socialist rhetoric cloaked a kleptocratic regime. It cloaked pseudo-socialist kind of approach, which basically talked about a verisimilitude of class struggle, which targeted wealthy elements in society, and there was a huge crime wave there. Ambassadors were kidnapped, a few weeks after I arrived there. Diplomats were being kidnapped, and when there was a big protest against it from the diplomatic community, they stopped, which unfortunately also indicated a measure of official complicity. So these were the factors, that I bore in mind while analyzing this situation. Now, why did the U.S. do what it did? One takeaway from this, of course, for me was that ideology is dangerous. Whether it's right-wing or left-wing, it masks exactly the opposite of what it purports to pronounce. So why did the U.S. do what it did? Of course, there are many elements of Dr. Joshi's thesis that I agree with, but at the same time, I think one should give a little more primacy to the importance of oil. We were actually importing 3 million barrels per day during my tenure, and the main reason why we weren't importing more was that Venezuela was simply crashing its oil economy. ONGC investments were doing very poorly there, and they were not being allowed to invest in productive capacity. So this was a problem, and the reason that I would prefer to focus on is that the U.S. national security strategy has talked about keeping adversarial influences out of the Western Hemisphere, and it has also talked about the criticality of strategic minerals and oil. Now, oil has a different dimension apart from just the quantities. Oil today is dollar denominated, and the control of oil supplies becomes a very critical factor in maintaining the supremacy of the dollar. Now, we've all seen what's going on in terms of the move away from U.S. treasuries, the piling into gold, silver, commodities, including oil. China especially is building up huge oil reserves, and also investing in gold and silver. In fact, the shortage of silver in the market, physical silver in the market, is probably because of China's cornering that market and the supplies. So to have control over oil supplies in the long term, when, the Exxon CEO said that it's uninvestable, but what they missed was he meant uninvestable today. Once investments are made in that sector, then the oil, by the way, Reliance was importing the entirety of oil from Venezuela and processing it in its Jamnagar refinery and re-exporting it, adding value. So we were quite happy with that, because usually it's the other way around. We export, low-value products and import high-value products. In this case, it was the opposite. So and one very interesting post that came out recently was that Russia and India had agreed last year to have their oil trade now they had made an institutional agreement to have Russia buy Indian securities. So now instead of the so-called rupee payment mechanism in which the rupees were just accumulating in some bank account, now there was an actual working sustainable basis for paying for these oil imports. And that is when the tariffs were suddenly increased on India. I'm not suggesting, I have no proof that there was a direct correlation. Operation Sindoor also had something to do with it. But definitely the fact that trade in oil was escaping from the dollar area could have been a factor in this whole exercise of establishing control. Now, I can't say that President Trump has a very coherent strategy. The way he operates, one doesn't seem to be able to really tie everything together. But let us not forget, he's advised by Peter Thiel. He's advised by all these big tech companies. The big tech companies, in fact, have won a huge reprieve in India by getting a foreign tax holiday on their data centers here, and Indian data centers. So have not been given this tax reprieve. So he does listen to them, and they could have influenced some parts of his policy. Now, we are in a very sweet spot because India never really encouraged very close ties with the Chavistas. They were very keen to have presidential visits, which did not happen. The only way we could have justified it is if they had agreed to a proposal for a rupee payment mechanism, which they didn't. The Venezuelans have a lot of respect for India, for its spirituality, and we are on a good wicket right now. So if a democratic and sovereign Venezuela comes out of all this, then that would be a good outcome. Marco Rubio, in his testimony to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, has indicated that the end game is about normalization and return of democracy. And Delcy has just announced that they're going to work for a general amnesty. So I'm quite optimistic, actually, cautiously optimistic that things will work out in the end, and hopefully this will not be a template for other. And just one more small observation. Regarding sovereignty and international law, when was international law respected in Iraq or in Libya? In Venezuela, it was a very limited operation with very minimal casualties, and the furor over sovereignty erupted when one country in the north turned its attention to Denmark and Greenland. Otherwise, they were all silent when all these incursions on sovereignty of the countries of the south was taking place. So again, I'm saying that I'm not dismissing at all that this could be a template for less palatable actions in the future, and we have seen them in application vis-a-vis our own country, but still I'm cautiously optimistic. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Smita, for sticking to time, and that was really brilliant, I must say so. And I think she brought in a lot of new factors, actually, characteristics of this operations. In fact, I have not gone into the details because I thought we didn't have a panel which was more military or in orientation. How this operation was conducted, there have been questions marks whether it was a technology that helped Americans to successfully extricate Maduro, or it was the money power which managed to buy people in his close proximity, which facilitated that sort of a thing. That's a question yet to be answered, and I think will be answered decades later. But what is important is, and what you highlighted is, that virtually everybody heaved a sigh of relief. Now, this is a very, very significant factor. Now, if that's going to be the incentive, are we going to see another operation closer home? That's an issue, because we also have an supposedly unpopular regime, again in an oil-rich country and an energy-rich environment. But how does that justify Greenland? And what is India's thing? Because now this question comes to mind. I actually didn't pay that much of attention when you said ONGC and Reliance both had stakes and had very valuable things. So maybe when we say that yesterday's President Trump's tweet says India will stop buying from Russia and potentially from Venezuela, do we see these issues? And of course, de-dollarization is a full different ball game altogether. We could have a discussion on that someday. But one thing is certain. If predictability has a new antonym, it is Donald Trump. That there is no doubt about it. And well, I'll now request Ambassador Sinha, who was India's Chief Information Commissioner. He has been India's ambassador to Venezuela, and he has been our High Commissioner to UK. And of course, he has a significant military background. So he can even talk about the characteristics of the operations. So over to him for 10 to 15 minutes.
Thank you, Captain Bansal, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's always difficult to bring up the rear when all the main points have been made. But I'm going to try and frame my discussion by paraphrasing James Carville. He was a strategist for Bill Clinton in his campaign, and in 1992, he said, it's the economy, stupid. In this case, it's the oil, stupid. So on the early hours of the 3rd of January this year, something earth-shaking. It was earth-shaking because we were still recovering from the revelry of the New Year, when we were hit by this news that special ops was carried out in Venezuela, and President Maduro, Nicolas Maduro, and his wife. When I was there, she was his common law wife, but he got married to her later, Celia Flores. And I'm trying to search for the right word. Abducted, that's the word that comes to mind. But a better word would be rendition. What the CIA does and has done in the past in the Middle East and elsewhere. It was an act of rendition in complete violation of international law. And you might argue international law is something that favors X, Y, or Z. But the point is that there is a rules-based order. And what the US did stood that rules-based order on its head. And I think Captain Bansal mentioned, tomorrow it could be Khomeini, day after it could be somebody else. So the fact of the matter is, might is right. And that's what we are sort of living through right now, the law of the jungle, so to speak. And when you say that oil is not perhaps the reason, then yes, democracy certainly isn't. Democracy isn't. It's avarice and greed. If you recall, Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, $303 billion. Barrels, 303 billion barrels. It couldn't exploit its oil reserves because, as Dr. Joshi said, it's heavy crude. It's heavy sour crude. But I'm not sure if you're aware that when American companies went in the 70s and made Caracas the Paris of Latin America and basically siphoned off all its wealth, not all, but a great deal of its wealth to wherever their headquarters were. It may have been the Paris of the East, because Caracas is a very pretty place, but the people were suffering. And that is why in 1999, when Hugo Chavez came to power on an agenda of Bolivarian socialism, he won that election fair and square. Now, before that, just keep in mind that the heavy sour crude was being processed in the refineries of the Gulf Coast, in Mississippi, in Texas, in Louisiana. These refineries were basically catering to that heavy sour crude from Venezuela. And when India got interested, and in fact, when Ambassador Smita was there after me, the numbers had gone up. In my time, it was much less, 250,000 barrels per day. Reliance and SR, a smaller, much smaller amount, were importing and refining. When I tried to get the PSUs, the public sector oil companies, to do it, I even went to Mangalore, to MRPL and others. They very politely said, we will try, but they had no intention of investing in technology that would have given them the capacity to refine heavy sour crude. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is because it was a very good economic model. You would wonder why companies in India, so far away, so far removed from Venezuela, in a different hemisphere, would be importing oil from Venezuela. It was not just India. China was importing much more. And there was a very simple economic logic to it. The VLCCs that supplied oil to the US from the Middle East, from the Gulf, when they were returning empty, they would do a short detour to Venezuela, pick up oil, and take it to China, to India, and wherever else. So what I'm trying to say is that President Trump himself, in fact, admitted in the press conference that it is our oil. And why does he say it's our oil? Because of the American companies that exploited it. In 1976, when Petróleos de Venezuela, PDVSA, as it's called, the National Oil Company, was set up, it was in partnership with the American and European companies. They were working together in trying to exploit the reserves there. But in 2007, President Chavez nationalized PDVSA. And as a result, a large number of engineers, technicians, and investors left. Perhaps the only company that stayed back right till the end was, if I'm not mistaken, ConocoPhillips. But now what has happened is he claims it's his oil. He has a right to exploit it and sell it at a price that he decides to whoever he decides. So as a result, Delcy Rodriguez rings up Prime Minister Modi the other day and has a discussion. And 2 days later, we hear about an India-US trade deal, and an announcement that India could buy oil from Venezuela. India was buying oil from Venezuela. In fact, when I was there was an agreement signed by ONGC Videsh and PDVSA for an oil field, not a very big one, called San Cristobal. And then I actually visited the Orinoco Belt, and there was an ExxonMobil oil field called Carabobo. And we managed to get that in partnership with PDVSA, Repsol, ONGC Videsh, and Oil India. Now, these were investments that were being made. India-Venezuela relations doesn't start with oil. In 1968, Mrs. Indira Gandhi visited Caracas, and she was received with great fanfare by President Leone. And the streets of Caracas were decked up to receive our Prime Minister. We've had much in common with Venezuela over the years, whether it was the non-aligned movement, the G77 and the defunct G15. We had a lot in common with Venezuela. However, Chavez was a charismatic leader. He won elections. Of course, his charisma was dying out by the end, like most autocratic leaders. But Maduro, who was a foreign minister when I was there, he was the foreign minister when President Chavez was the president when I was there. Later on, he became vice president. Chavez's chosen successor. Very humble beginnings as a bus driver, but rose through the ranks of the party. In fact, his wife, Celia Flores, I found, who was at that time the president of the National Assembly, far better informed on general geopolitics, etc. However, what is important is that what has happened in Venezuela is something that has to be condemned. I mean, there's nothing you can do about it because you counter it, but as I said, it's sort of the law of the jungle sets in. And this is not something new. Remember, when was it? I think Allende, Salvador Allende in Chile in September 1973 was toppled by the dictator Augusto Pinochet. In Grenada was invaded in October 1983. Noriega was picked up in January 1990. These are just three examples. There are many, many examples, and I'm sure those of you who follow Latin America will know. So I think what we need to understand is the Monroe Doctrine, which was enunciated 200 years ago, more than 200 years ago, basically aimed at the European powers to stay away from what is the Americas then, is now become the Monroe Doctrine, which basically includes the Western Hemisphere. And frankly, I still don't know what the limits of the Western Hemisphere is, because if you include Denmark and Greenland, etc., it would extend very flexibly. But I think what we must understand that we are in a dystopian state. The world is in a flux, and we need to keep our head down and build our own capabilities. And I think that's what this government is trying to do. And despite all the hullabaloo about the trade deal, I think I haven't seen the fine print of the trade deal with the United States, but the trade deal with the EU was something I would never imagine would be concluded. It's circumstances that got that deal together a week, 10 days ago. And one with the UK, in which I was involved also earlier, was concluded last year. So these are significant steps. India is I wouldn't call it a middle power, it's multi-aligned. And it is hedging to the best of its capability, and I think doing rather well. But I want to address one point. PM Carney has become the buzz. You know, everybody's talking about what a great speech. It was a very good speech. It indeed was. And if I had got the quote right, middle powers should get together, for if you are not on the table, you are on the menu. That's correct. It is. But who are the middle powers? Canada? Canada, which has benefited right through from its proximity to the United States. It is rather rich that the Prime Minister of that country is now talking about middle powers and getting together. So I think we need to be very clear as to what we want to achieve. And as far as I can see, we are heading in the right direction. I think it was mentioned the presence of hostile powers. And I remember the Bay of Pigs. I was a young boy, but I remember the Bay of Pigs incident. The US does not want an inimical power in its fist. No big power, no country actually. Why a big power, even a small power wouldn't want it, but the US can do something about it. And that is why the Monroe Doctrine was enunciated and now become the Monroe Doctrine. But the fact of the matter is that where do you draw a line? We know that both Russia and China were present, heavy investments, including arms. And we know that Maduro was an extremely unpopular leader. He had lost the last election, and from all accounts, the opposition candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez, had won 70% of the vote. But where is Edmundo Gonzalez now? He's in exile in Spain. And Maria Corina Machado, despite presenting the Nobel Prize to the occupant of the White House, is in the shadows. So much for realpolitik. And you have Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president, as the president now. You have Diosdado Cabello, the real strong man of the party, of the Bolivarian Socialist Party, still and indicted in that New York court, where the Maduro family, Maduro, his wife Celia Flores, and the son have been indicted. Cabello is still the interior minister. Padrino is still the defense minister. So if it was a demonstration effect, I must say it was a very, very successful demonstration effect. But since Captain Bansal asked me to talk about some military aspects, I am not a military person. There are many people here who know more about me. I will just say one thing. They had the largest armada assembled in the Caribbean Sea. And we knew something was going to happen. In fact, Maduro had spoken to Trump 2 weeks or a week before, or 10 days before the operation, Absolute Resolve. So we knew there was going to be an operation, but the way it was conducted in the stealth of the night, and half of Caracas, there was a blackout. Obviously, technology played a role. Whether there were people who were on the take inside, time will tell. But the fact that Delcy Rodriguez is still there, making strong statements in public, but very conciliatory in private, I mean, there hangs a tale. But I wouldn't want to jump to conclusions. The fact of the matter is that we will buy oil from Venezuela, and hopefully at a discounted price if President Trump wills so. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Fascinating subject. I think there's no doubt Maduro talked to Trump a few days before the operation. We just seen the other day Iranian president sanctioned talks with the United States. I don't know if that talks of the precursor of something which is coming up. Nationalization of oil companies has always been a problem. Mossadegh tried it. He was overthrown. So nationalization has always created problems. But I don't agree. See, Chile in 1973 was a coup staged by CIA. It was not picked. You didn't pick up. Coups have been staged all over. I think throughout history, coups have been staged by foreign intelligence agencies. That's not a unique thing. Grenada was an invasion. You could equate it with Babrak Karmal's entry into Kabul on Soviet tanks. But Panama also can be justified to some extent because the operation started from the Canal Zone. And I think after a US official was killed and the people moved in. But Caracas, 3rd January 2026, to my mind, in my limited knowledge, I have not been able to find a similar operation in history. So I may be wrong, but that's what I feel. So to me, it sets a new metrics.
If I may, Osama bin Laden.
Osama bin Laden was not a head of the state. So that's why I'm saying a fugitive being picked up from anywhere is okay. Well, now I'll open this probably for question and answers. There's somebody raising hands there, and then you have 2, 3. You can just give it. Start from there at the back. He raised his hand first.
Hi, good evening.
Please identify yourself and be brief. And we'll take 3, 4 questions and then ask the panelists to respond. And let me make it clear, panelists are not bound to answer each and every question.
Sure enough.
They can select which question to answer, which not to answer. Please ask your question.
Okay, so my name is Gustavo Lozano. I am working in Cervantes Institute that belongs to the government of Spain. Well, I think that the first thing that we should do is to use the proper language, no? This was not an operation, this was an attack. He was not extracted, he was kidnapped. So once we speak properly, so we can discuss, no? That is one thing that I think is very important. Because if we keep using language that is trying to cover what happened, we're not going to get to the bottom of the things, no? This is something new. I do think so, but not in the sense that Mr. Joshi said. I mean, from 1947, USA only has successfully do 100 regime change. 100 since 1947. That is nothing new at all. Respect of the international law during the Cold War, Russia didn't respect in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary, and USA in the rest of the world. And we can talk not only about Chile, we can talk about Vietnam, we can talk about many other places. 1965, Juan Bosch in Dominican Republic. In the 80s, Contra in Nicaragua, and we can go on and on and on and on. So the thing that I do believe that this is a precedent is that USA has decided that it's not anymore the country that is going to rule the world. They finally realize that they are not the hegemon, and they have to constrict themselves to America. Because they cannot do what Bush's father did, invading Iraq, or Bush's son did. They cannot do that. And that is why this operation, as it's been called, is the way that this was. Because they know that they cannot invade a country because the people who support Trump in the presidency are against military Americans dying in an invasion. That is why. So the precedent, from my point of view, is USA has declared, yes, we cannot rule the world, and we are going to get just America. And then let's see what the others they will do in their own backyards, Russia or China, or in the Middle East, Israel.
Please be brief and be pointed question. Thank you so much.
Basically, it's not a question. It's just talking about, I think that the frame is completely different to what you all say. Is what I think.
Thank you. Yeah. Identify yourself and ask the question quick. Yeah.
Hello.
Be brief.
Hello. Yeah. I'm Daksh. I'm a student of political science at Delhi University. My question is to Professor Sunjoy that, I'm a student of IR, and at least for the past some time we have seen, this trend amongst academics that, this Western-led international order is, going to transmute into something more regional, BRICS and more regional organizations. Then there are authors like Amitav Acharya that talk about multiplex world orders or systems of the world. So how does academia look at, the idea of permissible sovereignty, and how do we study IR better going forward? And my second question, if I can be greedy enough, is that the Maduro's statement in the US court that he's a prisoner of war and that he's, a decent man and he should be given special protections as in the form of immunity in terms of head of state. So what's the point of, going through all that procedure? Thank you.
Yeah, please, ma'am.
Good afternoon. My name is Maria. I am from Osmania University. And it's a simple question. So, because I am really surprised that in your dissertation, you banished totally the 1,019 sanctions that US and European Union did against Venezuela. and are the cause of the most important crisis in the country. So what about this? What position this have in your dissertation? And the other thing is, like, I agree that whatever people said or whatever is the position of the media and the narrative of the media, the kidnapping of one president in functions, what is the legal or could be the legal position of that in your case? And the other question is, if this, the Maduro is not the president of Venezuela because he lost the past election, so why Trump did not recognize this guy that is in Spain, Edmundo González, and this lady, Maria Corina Machado, and why he did not recognize them and put in the power? Because in my humble opinion, he said, oh, she's a nice lady, but she does not like people, or the people of Venezuela not recognize her. So what about this statement? These two questions.
Okay. Yeah, last. Here. Just. Yeah, here. Wait, here. Second row. Yeah, behind you. Yeah. Yeah. After this, we'll ask the panel, and then we'll come to the second round. Yeah, please.
My name is Jitendra Oja, former Joint Secretary, Cabinet Secretariat, and now I'm visiting faculty with many institutions outside this country on geopolitics and security. Two questions very pointed to both Mr. Joshi and Ambassador Sinha. Covert operations have always been a reality in this world. But what has brought about this brazenness where not only international norms, rules, but even international morality and trust has been slaughtered? Do you think democracies have failed to evolve optimally? Especially a country like India, our suboptimal growth compared to China has lent a degree of strategic imbalance in this global order, which is encouraging something like this. How can we move forward? Or what can we do as Indians? I'm just tossing up an idea that we can enforce some degree of morality. Look, law, etc., is acceptable only to an extent that those who are seeking to breach it, they have a degree of fear, isn't it? So that degree of fear appears to have vanished because of this extreme inequality. And technology has given enormous powers, but it hasn't brought about the kind of statecraft which was anticipated after decolonization and UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, those lofty ideals. We have not been able to live up to that. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just request the panelists in reverse order to answer whatever they wish to answer. It's purely their discretion. You may or may not answer any question. Just take 2-3 minutes, you can answer any of these questions, starting with Ambassador Sinha.
The gentleman from Cervantes Institute, I completely agree with you, except on one point, that the US is no more a hegemon. It's the Thucydides trap. The declining hegemon is being challenged by the rising or aspiring hegemon. But I won't go into that. I think there was something you asked about the legal position, right? About the legal position. Obviously, if the election that was held in 2024, if Edmundo González is believed to have won 70% of the vote, he should be the president right now. But since that was overturned fraudulently by Maduro, the problem is now, if the US is intervened because of parachuting democracy, then Edmundo González should be the president right now. Obviously, that was not the reason why the US carried out this operation or this abduction, or whatever you call it. So I think, as per the Constitution, the vice president becomes the interim president or president, and then elections are supposed to be held. Correct me if I'm wrong, 30 days, I think. But that's also not happening. So it's going to be decided in Washington who will be the president for how long and when the next election will be held, if at all. So I think it was quite a wasted effort giving the Nobel Peace Prize to the occupant there. Mr. Oja, right? So I think That's a very interesting question, because the international order, as I said, has been sort of, the rules-based order has been stood on its head. It's simply might is right. Now, in such a situation, there is only one legitimate organization, which is the United Nations. And unfortunately, the United Nations is moribund. Despite repeated efforts to reform the United Nations by India and others, many others, the P5, the permanent five that hold the veto in the Security Council, are not interested in reforming the Security Council, despite all the statements that they make when they come to Delhi that they support India's candidature. I handled that envelope in the turn of the century. We were very excited when the Russians and then the Brits and then Obama came later. They come here and make statements that please us. Their delegations in New York actively sabotage any attempt to reform the Security Council. So in such a situation, you do have where international legitimacy gets questioned, and you have people like President Trump, who has decided that he wants to do it, it's my way or the highway. And he's doing pretty much what he can. What we can do, in my opinion, India can't do much really. One, we are an emerging power, and the other superpower, if Russia is too involved in Ukraine, China is still trying to build its strengths. And it will be very interesting what happens in Iran. If there is a military operation in Iran, will China step in, apart from supplying armaments and intelligence? I don't think so, because they are not yet ready. So I think what's right now, we are in, as I said, a dystopian age, but we have a vacuum also, which President Trump is exploiting the best way he can.
Excellent observations. And I do not disagree at all with the immorality of the American actions in many parts of the world, including in Chile. I was in Moscow in 1973 when Allende, about whom we've just seen a fantastic documentary, was overturned, and we burst into tears, me and my Russian friends, and it was quite shocking. I just wanted to really just give a little flavor of the situation in Venezuela, which I don't think was really along those lines. And I'm not trying to excuse the American action there. I was just trying to explain the circumstances behind it. Regarding sanctions on Venezuela, the deterioration of the Venezuelan economy, the destruction of agriculture was already complete. I mean, I flew all over Venezuela to Merida, wonderful university there, and there was zero cultivation going on. There was no industry left. So the thing is that the destruction was already almost complete by then, and I wasn't there when the sanctions kicked in because they were levied. A few of them were levied while I was there, but the really rigorous ones came later. So I'm not very sure, but also the deterioration in the oil economy. ONGC would constantly come to me. Other companies also would come and say that, look, they're not allowing us to take a simple decision. The file won't move. We can't invest. We can't improve productive capacity. So I'm just talking from this particular experience on these particular issues, but I didn't mean to justify American actions all over the world. And definitely, I mean, there are some issues on which we have taken a huge issue. For example, I mentioned the big tech issue here, and giving tax exemption to foreign data centers. And we are very much worried about the incursions into our sovereignty by these kind of actions. So I would not justify them at all. I'm just trying to explain the particular situation in Venezuela. Thank you.
Well, I'll conceptually actually cover some of these questions which have been raised. First is, of course, about the point about covert operations and why that covert operations have always been there. Covert operations were conducted, yes, if you start looking at how things were conducted. The powers that did what they could do. And wherever they had interest, they intervened through covert operations. And all the examples which have been given are perfectly correct. What has changed? If you look at the history, it's primarily to do with the history of how multilateral institutions were functioning and what was the order within those multilateral institutions. During the Cold War, in spite of everything, the balance of powers ensured that multilateral institutions had to function. That there was the only way that you could get anything done, and you had the whole history of non-aligned movement. A bloc came up. So they were, in spite of everything, in spite of saying that there were no middle powers, there was a powerful voices emerging from the other side, which had to be taken into consideration. So overt action, not possible. Covert action, possible. The problem once starts arising after the unipolar moment. When you had the interventions in in the 90s, then you had them again in 2000s without any sanctions, without any multilateral sanctions, which happened, like what happened in Iraq, what happened in Afghanistan. Sanctions were imposed earlier also, but sanctions were ultimately meant to be imposed through the instruments of the United Nations. That was a time of actual covert action. Once that became unnecessary, sanctions became unilateral, and actions began taken by coalitions of the willing. Completely illegal actions. Weapons of mass destruction, the whole story. Complete egg on the face in any other situation. So once that started happening, the need for covert action also disappears. So when they intervened in Iraq, when they intervened in Afghanistan, they did not need covert action. They could do it blatantly. And in a way, I think as multipolarity has arisen, China has become a challenger, the need now arises, how do you maintain power? See, this is, when I was speaking, I was primarily saying that this is about projection of power. How do you continue projecting power when you have rivals, when you have challengers? What messages you're going to give them? What signals you're going to give them? So signals are being given very clearly. Okay, come and challenge us if you can challenge us here. Now let us see how this evolves. There's something else happening, very interesting. See, first, either you challenge them, the second is you co-opt them. Countries which have leverage are being slowly co-opted. You could see how Russia has been on the sides, kindly being co-opted after Ukraine to say, okay, that is Europe's problem. That's not the United States' problem. There's a process of co-option happening there. Then that process of co-option happening with China. We keep on asking why the penal tariffs have not been imposed on China. Why was China let out? Why are technology concessions now being given to China after seeing China as a technology rival? China has leverage. Now, in this game, leverage is going to matter. Which country has leverage? And when you start talking of India's situation, see, strategic autonomy cannot be a slogan anymore. Strategic autonomy becomes a matter of hard power, hard infrastructure, hard security, ability to be able to look after yourselves. Now, that is the direction which countries will have to move in. And the message about uniting and perishing, or how do you want to survive in this world? Unity is a good idea. Unity can work. But the methodology which will be used in this world, in this predatory world, is going to be very simple. That you do not let all negotiations are not, there will be no negotiations with BRICS. There are no negotiations with the EU. EU is a rival. EU is just left out of the picture. Bilateral negotiations are the norm, because bilateral negotiations make it possible to divide and conquer. So these are the strategies which are going to be played. So people keep saying this is a zero-sum game, it's geopolitics about chess. Big powers play chess. There will be chess moves between China, there will be chess moves with Russia, between the US. What do the smaller powers do? Smaller powers don't play chess. The smaller powers can only play Bagh Bakri. You can't kill the predator. You can only constrain the room to maneuver that the predator has, hedge him, corner him, use bits of leverage here, use bits of leverage there, unite, shrink the space where he can operate by moving in a coordinated manner. That is what Carney was saying. Are you going to unite and confront this? That is the only way out. Or are you going to cut side deals? And then ultimately, the point which I made was that if coercion becomes the norm of governance, then we are in a dangerous space.
Thank you. I think divide and conquer reminds me of East India Company. So, well, we'll have another round of questions. Comb, and then we'll...
Thank you to all the speakers. In connection with what happened in Venezuela, there have been rumors about the next American kidnapping, or call it what you will, in Cuba in Colombia, possibly, and then there is also talk about destabilizing Brazil, because Brazil is the giant of South America, which somehow has to be brought back into the American fold like Argentina was. How do you see that? And then I would like to call your attention to the existence of very powerful lobbies inside the US, which are often orienting this kind of steps that are taken for violent overthrow. I will mention, for example, Epstein. In the Epstein file, it's obvious that Epstein was involved in attempts to overthrow Putin, perhaps assassinate him, and there were a number of other assassinations that were being contemplated where for some reason, because of Epstein's connection to Israel, where he was being involved. So what is your view of all that?
Hi sir, hi ma'am, hi everyone. Myself Krishna Sen from Kirodimal College, University of Delhi. My question is, how can the United States use sanctions, diplomacy and support for the opposition in Venezuela to protect its energy interest, counter Russia and China, and actually help democracy last longer? Thank you.
Sir, my question is to Sanjay sir. So first, like you said, that this is a lever which US holds now on the Venezuela supply. What happens right now? You have said it has gone down to about 900 barrels a day. But what if the supply increases and it increases over a period of time? Do we see the prices coming down? Because ultimately, if it is to counter the cheap Russian oil and asking India also to join back on the table, not on the menu, the impact of that, and whether OPEC would be able to counter by withholding their supplies on the prices part, that is one. And if it is all about that oil, second thing is that this operation in particular which has happened, we understand that China was having its stake there. Russia probably would have known it better because Venezuela is also one of the largest oil reserve in the world, and probably a threat to the cheap Russian oil, which is supposedly funding its war effort in Ukraine. So looking at that picture, was it that this was a one strike thing right under the nose of China and Russia trying to protect and withhold that regime so that the supply does not increase? That is one. Another question. And then third, America is not in the purview of ICJ and ICC. And they have already declared that after 2019, head of the state, that is Maduro, is not a deemed head of state. So the immunity per se from US point of view was taken away. But the customary international law still says that the head of state enjoys immunity, though UN is moribund at this state, but still there are other nations who still hold a valid stake in Venezuela and recognize it. So in that situation, does this become the demonstration or the point which has been communicated by this action? Kindly elaborate on that. Thank you, sir.
Greetings, everyone. Thanks for organizing this. I am BTech graduate. Sir, as mentioned, US Armada was present for more than 6 months. But particularly on 3rd January, Nicolas Maduro met with Chinese ambassador to Venezuela. Could that have been the triggering point? And if yes, what could have been the if part, as China is today not a small force to be ignored?
Good evening. So I am Harsh. I am a student of law at National University of Law, Patiala. My question is open to everyone. So while we see the executive of the USA becoming mightier day by day, at the same time, are we also observing the decay of the judiciary and the legislature of the USA? Because even if we focus on the act of Venezuela, there are both violations. There is no congressional nod. That is, of course, that is a gray area of law, but primarily there has to be a congressional nod. And even the US domestic precedents say that, taking from Ambassador Sinha's phraseology, we will not try or assume jurisdiction over a person who has been illegally renditioned. So are we at the same time seeing the decay of the other two systems of this, let's say, a hegemonic country?
The question was addressed directly to me. Venezuela oil and what happens to oil prices. In short, you see, there's a paradox here. The paradox is that if you said, will oil prices drop? First of all, investments in Venezuelan oil are going to take some time. They're not going to flow very readily. I did not say that oil was the most important reason. I said the exact opposite. Oil was not the reason. Oil was used as a lever more because the whole financial system sits on it. Sanctions sit on that. So how do you exercise leverage? It was an instrument in this particular case, which has been used again on Iran, which has been used on Venezuela at this point of time. To apply maximum pressure, it matters to Venezuela. Sanctions matter to Venezuela because those sanctions destroy the economy. Sanctions have mattered on Iran because they are what has destroyed an economy. So if there is trouble, if there's poverty in Venezuela, if Iranians are out in the streets, to a large extent, I would say 90% of the reason is because of sanctions imposed by the United States of America. Let's be very clear. Had these sanctions not been there, things may not have been heaven on earth, but things would not have been so bad. The economy would still have been functional. Venezuela would probably have been able to pay back. The Chinese put in large investments. Ultimately, what did China do? China had to ultimately take its money out from Venezuela by payments in oil because of sanctions. So the whole system gets clogged up. So you need these levers, and sanctions have been used as levers. So if oil is to be produced in Venezuela, first of all, that oil does not become viable at prices below $70, $80. The price has to be higher, not lower, for those investments to be justified. US shale oil, for that matter, US, we say, is producing a lot of shale oil. At the moment, shale oil itself is suffering because low prices of $60 are not very remunerative for shale producers. So new investments in shale are not happening because of these prices. So for these to come up, prices have to rise. So there actually has to be a shortage. How do you create shortages? Shortages are created by ensuring that certain oil does not get to the market. Russian oil does not get to the market. If you remove 11 million barrels a day of production from the market by sanctioning them, by forcing sanctions on them, yes, there is a possibility price rise. If Iran is sanctioned, prices rise. Because yes, Iran is always been a substantial supply. Iraq. See, all these areas are basically, that is how oil is used as a lever. In Venezuela's case, oil is not the lever. So it's a different story in Venezuela. The answers are somewhere else. And as far as your question about heads of state killing a head of state, well, the US has killed heads of state before. This is not the first time. Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi. You can engineer death by various means. Why do you need to hang him?
Just to respond to your question, I mean, you mentioned Colombia and Cuba. We didn't talk about drugs because that was another ostensible reason why the Venezuela operation happened. But you're aware that Venezuela has a porous border with Colombia, but it's not a haven for drug trafficking. There's certainly drugs awash in the market, and you would expect that in a situation where the law and order is broken down. But for cocaine, the conduit is Colombia. For fentanyl, it is Mexico. So if they're going to, I don't think they're going to target Mexico. Colombia, who knows? Brazil is a different kettle of fish. And let's be very clear. I mean, if you want to do this sort of operation, that Operation Absolute Resolve in Brazil, it's going to be very difficult, or for that matter, in Iran even. So I think the MAGA doesn't want boots on the ground. The Americans don't want boots on the ground. And they can try their very best to bomb, a country out of shape and missile strikes, etc. In Iran, for instance, even if they abduct Khamenei, if they can, I'm not sure whether they can, but even if they do, the IRGC is very strong. They're not going to melt away. They're very unpopular, but there is a vested interest in Iran who basically want this regime to continue because they are the ones who have prospered. So it's not going to be easy. The Americans might want to do it, but I'd like to see how they do it. I mean, time will tell.
Thank you. I think we've had a fascinating discussion. I do agree on Iran, actually. I have a different viewpoint, but we'll discuss Iran some other day. And there is a fact that one size does not fit all. We saw in Kabul, 20 years, billions of dollars, and you returned the regime back to Taliban. So what was happened in Venezuela need not happen in Kabul. What happened in Venezuela need not happen in Brazil. It could be replicated in Cuba. I wouldn't be surprised. That's quite feasible. But Brazil is a different kettle of fish, in fact, and that's what I feel. Iran, I just take 1 minute to say, having visited Iran on a number of occasions, if they actually remove Khamenei, the new regime will come. Because the present government there are enough people who want to actually break free, and they are hemmed in by the presence of Vilayat-e-Faqih. In fact, the present president came to power promising a lot of things which he actually could not do because he also became pragmatic after coming to power, as has been the norm. Okay, thank you very much. I'll now request my colleague Pavan to come for the felicitations, actually.
Thank you, sir. Now, as we wind up this discussion, may I request Air Marshal P.K. Roy, Member Governing Council of India Foundation, to kindly come to the dais and do the felicitation. Welcome, sir. We are very thankful to our speakers for gracing us and coming to the program. We would especially thank the India Habitat Center for always being supportive for our events. And most importantly, we are very thankful to our guests who have come and joined us for the discussion.
Please join us for a cup of tea outside, and our next program is on 18th February on new regimes in Bangladesh and Myanmar.